you just mentioned France and like Bastille Day and whatnot. Let's just get really nerdy. So I know that when we get into the Enlightenment and a lot of reactionary type people will criticize. I just make a blanket statement like the Enlightenment is bad, right? But the Enlightenment, really, there's a ton of different philosophies that were occurring during that time period. Which ones affected our culture and our politics here, and which ones which ones kind of set that paradigm that you mentioned that basically mean that our conservatism here is left wing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different figures who had influence, as you said, that during that confluence of ideologies, you could say. There's a good book called Fire in the Minds of Men that traces the history of the revolutionary faith, you could call it. So there were definitely medieval predecessors and parallels, and I just did a 5-hour lecture series from Malcolm Lambert's book, Medieval Heresy, who's a famous medievalist, and in his historical treatise, he covers all the movements, the Bogomils, the Gnostics, the Thomas Müntzer rebellion, how these different Joachim of Fior, how these groups influenced the revolutionary ideologies of the time period that you're talking about. And so all of that plays into like these currents of spiritualism, the spiritual Franciscans, the idea of a third age of the spirit that would come, that would bring this sort of utopia, a revivalism, communitarianism, communism, communalism. All of those ideas were floating around, and at times they were part of secret societies. They went underground. They were part of Rosicrucian or Masonic philosophies for a time. And really, right around the time of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment is when you can start to see those Rosicrucian ideas really come to the fore, where the idea was we can start a kind of idealistic republic. So they look back a lot to Plato's philosophy. They looked to Neoplatonism at times. They looked to the Renaissance magicians and characters that were influenced by Plato, like Marsilio Ficino or Cornelius Agrippa. And so there was all of these bubbling undercurrents of not just liberal ideology, but also esoteric and hermetic philosophy. I just did a stream last night with Church of the Eternal Logos, and we were talking about some of those currents that were floating around at that time. And I would agree that not everything about the Enlightenment is necessarily bad, especially if you know about the Latin papacy during that period. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of bad stuff going on, very well known. It's not even denied by any reputable historians anymore. But of course, that doesn't justify the pendulum swing opposite extreme that happens in a lot of those revolutionary ideas. So you get corruption, and the natural result typically is, the swings to the opposite, right? Oh, then religion is corrupt, and you get, Voltaire saying that he won't be happy until he sees the last priest strangled with his own entrails. So these radical reactions are not the solution, even though they probably are hitting on legitimate problems. Ideologically, you have the same problems that somebody like David Hume points out, where David Hume just takes axioms from the classical peripatetic tradition, like the idea that there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses, from Aquinas, and Aquinas adopting that maxim from Aristotle. And he says, if this is the case, then there's really no scientific experiential knowledge for God, because you never, in the sense datum, experience causality, God, etc., or the first cause. You just experience phenomena A and phenomena B. And so Hume is actually correct in some of those critiques. I'm not saying humanism is correct. I'm saying that critiques are correct. He actually hits on some of the points that we as Orthodox would agree in terms of the problems in Latin and Western epistemology. I was just reading Vladimir Lossky's book, Image and Likeness, and he has a section towards the end of the chapter on the procession of the Spirit and the doctrine of eternal manifestation. And he hits on that there. He says that the medieval Latin tradition, especially when you get to the Second Council of Lyons, when you get to the Second Lateran Council, when you get to Florence, right, this time period solidifies dogmatically a certain conception in the scholastic doctrine of divine simplicity, which leads to a lot of later Western ideas, such as the revolutionary ethos and so forth, right? You get this skepticism, you get this idea that you can't really know or understand God in terms of the hesychast tradition, but rather God becomes a abstract philosophical speculation that you abstract a supremely simple essence from, that you deduce from creatures. And you can see this in Locke, you can see this in Kant. They do that very thing. And they even point out that problem. So those are the ideological issues that are running concurrent with these revolutionary problems. And again, people will misquote me and misstate what I'm saying. And they'll say, oh, he's a Humean. Oh, he's saying that. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the criticisms that some of these guys, even these atheist people, have is a result of problems in Western theology. And I mean, Losky backs me up. He says that in the book. So that's my critique of the whole period, is that the revolutionary ethos isn't really about some Masonic idea in the 1700s or something. It's an older idea going back to Hermetic and Neoplatonic ideas that became ensconced and dogmatized in Latin theology. And I can tell you the exact places in Benzinger where it's dogmatized. So that leads to the revolutions. That leads to the rejection of the authority of the papacy, because the papacy had an illegitimate authority based on philosophical problems and forgeries. The philosophical problems I'm talking about with filioque and divine simplicity, that leads to the whole collapse of that system. It leads to the Protestant deformation. It leads to all of these issues. And that's how we get to the outbreak of revolutions. And those revolutions, of course, were financed by banking interests. Quigley's very clear about that. He has a whole chapter about the banking interests that financed the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is then who gave us this notion of a false left-right. Do you want the right-wing revolution or do you want the left-wing revolution? And that's where we are today. America's left-right paradigm is the inheritance of that.
Yeah. So the Dark Enlightenment really started with the Great, well, before the Great Schism, really. It started with the Filioque, was the Dark Enlightenment. So most people don't think about it.
It's really the Neoplatonic doctrine of simplicity. And that's what becomes pretty much the paradigm for Aquinas. From Augustine up into Aquinas, Peter Lombard and his doctrine that's adopted at the Lateran Synod, and then into the medieval scholastics. That's the working paradigm. And that conditions the Council of Lyons in 1274 to contrast with the Orthodox definitions at the Palamite synods in the 1300s. So the East solidifies its positions in the Palamite synod, and the Latins solidify their positions in the ones I mentioned. And that's really the break between the two systems. And it's only natural that the starting points of one's philosophy or worldview, namely who God is and how God relates to the world, obviously that's going to condition the rest of your view. That's going to condition the way that you view anthropology. It's going to condition the way you view the body-soul problem, knowledge, epistemology. It's going to then condition your view of the state. So if you don't have the right theology, it's going to screw up your doctrine of church-state relations.